September 1944. A small village outside Nancy, Lorraine. The morning air is thick with the smell of wet earth and gunpowder. In the center of the square stands a 400-year-old stone church, its bell tower reaching for a gray, indifferent sky. Inside the crypt, 14 villagers huddle in the dark, praying for a silence that does not come. Suddenly, the sky screams. American shells, calculated and precise, rain down on German machine gun nests nearby. One shell strays. The ancient roof collapses in a roar of dust and timber. When the smoke clears, the heart of the village is a pile of jagged limestone and shattered glass. Father Augustin Martel stands in the ruins, clutching a cracked crucifix while American tanks roll past without stopping. No one looks back. But a single command car is about to pull over, revealing a side of General Patton the world rarely saw. This is the forgotten story of what General Patton did when his own artillery batteries accidentally leveled a 400-year-old French church in the heat of battle. It is a tale of unintended destruction and an even more unexpected act of personal restoration. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We tell the World War II stories that show the quiet moments that revealed who he really was. Corporal Silas Thorne was 24 years old, a quiet man from Olvine, Iowa, serving with the 35th Infantry Division. He was the son of a master mason who had spent 40 years laying the foundations of his town's brick schoolhouses and stone chapels. Silas grew up with the scent of wet lime on his skin, learning that a building was a promise made by one generation to the next. He had seen the labor it took to carve a single gargoyle, and the patience required to set a keystone. In his mind, these structures were the anchors of civilization, the only things that remained when the people were gone. As his unit rolled into the village outside Nancy, he watched the white limestone dust settle like snow over the ruins of the parish. He looked at the shattered stained glass and thought of his father's calloused hands, feeling a sense of shame that hit harder than any German mortar round. Major Harrison Vane was 38. An artillery coordinator from a prominent family in Philadelphia, he viewed the liberation of France through the lens of cold, mathematical efficiency. To Vane, every village was a grid, and every church tower was a potential nest for an enemy sniper that had to be eliminated without hesitation. He maintained that war was a business of subtraction, and that sentimentality was a dangerous flaw in a commanding officer. His ideology was simple: the mission dictates the cost, and the cost is always justified if the objective is taken. Vane carried himself with an air of unearned untouchability, keeping a pristine silk scarf tucked into his field jacket, even in the mud of Lorraine. He stood by the roadside, checking a gold pocket watch passed down through 3 generations of bankers. To him, the smoking crater in the center of the village was not a tragedy, but a cleared coordinate on a tactical map. The race across France in the late summer of 1944 was a marathon of iron and blood. After the breakout from the hedgerows of Normandy, the Allied armies surged eastward with a speed that shocked even the most optimistic planners in London and Washington. By September, the Third Army was biting deep into the Lorraine region, clawing its way toward the fortress city of Nancy and the German border beyond. The enemy was in full retreat, but they were not broken. They turned every stone farmhouse and medieval village into a temporary fortress, hiding machine guns behind centuries-old shutters and snipers in the rafters of ancient haylofts. For the American commanders on the ground, the solution was almost always mathematical. If a village held up a battalion for an hour, they called in the long guns. This was the era of the total fire mission, where speed was valued above all else to prevent the front from stagnating into the trench warfare of the previous generation. In the chaos of this lightning advance, the preservation of civilian architecture was a luxury few felt they could afford. Other officers often looked the other way when a historic monument or a local landmark was reduced to rubble, viewing the destruction as a necessary friction of war. There were no courts-martial for a stray shell, and no reprimands for a building that stood in the way of a clear line of sight. The landscape was being rewritten by high explosives, and the ghosts of the past were being buried under the debris of the present. In this environment of relentless forward motion, the silence of a destroyed sanctuary was usually ignored in favor of the roar of the engines. But on this morning, as the dust of the 400-year-old limestone hung in the damp air, the roar of the engines suddenly stopped. Lieutenant James Miller, a 26-year-old from Columbus, Ohio, stepped over a charred wooden beam and approached the major. He looked at the smoking pile of rubble that had once been the heart of the village. The air was thick with the smell of pulverized stone and ancient dust. "Major, the villagers are finally coming out of the crypt. They should be grateful they were underground," Vane said without looking up from his maps. "Sir, that church stood for 400 years. It was the only stone building left in this entire valley. It was a vertical obstacle in a designated combat sector," the major replied, checking his gold pocket watch. "There were no German guns in that steeple. Major, I scouted the area myself after the dust settled. It was empty. My map indicated a potential vantage point for enemy observers. I cleared the threat. We destroyed a sanctuary without a single enemy soldier inside," Miller said, his voice rising with a sharp edge of frustration. "I do not trade American casualties for French limestone and stained glass. Lieutenant Army regulations regarding cultural property are quite specific about avoiding religious sites whenever possible, sir. Tactical necessity overrides sentimentality every time. Miller, learn that if you want to keep your bars, the priest is standing in the ruins of his life's work. He is 67 years old and holding a broken crucifix. Then tell him to pray in the fields. This is a war zone, not a Sunday social. The villagers are standing in the street. They are watching our tanks roll by. They are not cheering us, Major. I am not here to win a popularity contest with French peasants. I am here to advance the line. We have engineers idle in the rear of the column. We could at least help them stabilize the remaining walls or clear the road. My engineers are for the advance. They are for pontoons and mine clearing. They are not for civilian masonry repair. It is a matter of basic decency, Major. Our shells did this. We owe them something for the mistake. The United States Army owes them a liberated country. I am not apologizing for the arithmetic of war. It was not arithmetic. It was a failure of judgment that did not have to happen. Watch your tone, Lieutenant. I have a family name that was respected in Philadelphia before your hometown was a dot on a map. Your name does not change the fact that this was collateral damage without a tactical justification. In this sector, I decide the justification, and I decide the cost. Now get back to your unit and move out." Miller looked at Vane's pristine uniform. He looked at the silver bars and the silk scarf. He saw a man who saw human beings as nothing more than numbers on a ledger. "I am filing this as a formal grievance in the mission log, Major Pilot. No one at Corps headquarters gives a damn about a pile of old bricks in a nameless village." Miller turned and walked back to his jeep. He felt a deep, biting heat in his chest. He called for his sergeant and opened the radio channel. He did not care about the social standing of the man in the polished boots. He described the smoking crater where the altar once stood. He described the priest. He described the refusal to even clear the road of sacred debris. The report reached Patton within the hour. The dust had barely settled when a lone jeep rumbled into the square. There was no escort and no sirens. Only the low growl of an engine and the sight of 4 silver stars gleaming on a helmet alerted the men that the commander of the Third Army had arrived. General George S. Patton stepped out before the vehicle had even come to a full stop. The ivory grips of his revolvers caught the pale light as he walked toward the mountain of limestone that used to be a house of God. He did not say a word to the officers standing nearby. He simply stood in the rubble, looking at the place where the altar had been. "Major, what was this building?" Patton asked. His voice was low and carried a sharp, rasping edge. "It was a tactical obstacle, General, an observation point for the enemy in a designated combat sector," Vane replied. "Did you find a single German observer in the wreckage?" "I did not, sir, but the risk was deemed unacceptable." "And the old man standing over there with the crucifix, is he a sniper?" "No, sir. That is the village priest." "So you traded a 400-year-old sanctuary for a suspicion that proved to be false." Patton turned his head slowly, his eyes cold and fixed on the major. "I followed the logic of the mission. General Lotzik is a fine tool for a clerk, Major, but it is a poor substitute for the eyes of a commander. You speak of the arithmetic of war as if it absolves you of the weight of what you destroy. You see a pile of bricks and timber. I see the soul of a people. This priest has spent 38 years in this village. He has baptized every child, married every couple, and buried every grandparent. This building was the only thing in their lives that was supposed to outlast the storm of this war. You believe that because we are the liberators, We are entitled to be careless with the things these people hold sacred. You think that because your name is written in the ledgers of Philadelphia, you can ignore the history written in these stones. But a man who destroys a house of God owes a debt, Major, even if the destruction was born of necessity, especially if it was born of your own pride. While you were checking your gold watch, this old man was pulling his neighbors out of the crypt. While you were justifying your coordinates, he was holding the pieces of his faith. We are not here to simply burn our way to the border. We are here to prove that the civilization we represent is worth the blood we are spilling to save it. If we leave nothing but craters and bitterness behind us, then we are no better than the men we are trying to defeat. You have a choice, Major. You can stay here and tell this priest that his life's work was a rounding error in your tactical report. Or you can take those engineers you said were too busy, and you can start moving every single piece of that rubble by hand. You will stabilize what is left. You will clear the sanctuary. And you will do it until your hands bleed. Decide now. Vane looked at the general, then at the ruins, and finally at his own pristine uniform. He saw no room for negotiation in the general's eyes. We will begin the clearing at once, sir. Patton did not acknowledge the answer. He simply reached up and did something his men almost never saw him do in a combat zone. He removed his helmet, the order was given, and the momentum of the Third Army's advance stalled for one specific square in Lorraine. Major Vane, his silk scarf tucked away and his hands already gray with stone dust, stood among his engineers as they began the grueling work of stabilization. The sound of heavy machinery was replaced by the rhythmic scrape of shovels and the grunt of men lifting massive blocks of ancient limestone. They worked under the watchful eye of the villagers, who stood in the shadows of their doorsteps, silent and wary. The smell of the rubble changed from the ozone of high explosives to the damp, earthy scent of disturbed history. Patton did not watch them for long. He walked to Father Martel, who still held his cracked crucifix. Without a word to his staff or the waiting press, the general pulled a personal checkbook from his pocket. He wrote a figure that would cover the cost of the raw materials needed to make the sanctuary whole again. He pressed the paper into the priest's trembling hands. He told the old man that a man who destroys a house of God owes a debt, even if the destruction was necessary. Then he stepped back into his jeep, the dust of the church still coating his four-star helmet as he drove toward the front. Corporal Silas Thorne returned to Olvine, Iowa, in late 1945. He took over his father's masonry business and spent the next 40 years building the foundations of his community. He died in 1988, leaving behind a family that remembered him as a man of few words and steady hands. On his desk sat a small piece of French limestone, a silent witness to the day the guns stopped. To Silas, that stone was a reminder that while war destroys, a man's true character is found in what he chooses to rebuild. Major Harrison Vane returned to Philadelphia and a career in finance. He remained a man of cold precision, convinced until his death in 1974 that his tactical decisions had been beyond reproach. He never understood why the clearing of a road in a nameless village remained the only part of his service record people ever cared to discuss. He died with his gold pocket watch still ticking, never acknowledging the debt Patton had forced him to pay. General Patton never spoke of the church or the check he wrote from his own funds. The world only learned of it when a letter from Father Martel was found in his private papers long after his death. Patton once wrote in a private reflection that a soldier who loses his reverence for God's house has lost the very thing he is fighting to protect. He was buried in late 1945, a man of iron who secretly understood the weight of a broken crucifix. Some historians argue that Patton's intervention was a performative act of penance that did little to address the systematic destruction caused by his aggressive tactics across the Lorraine region. They suggest that personal checks were mere sticking plasters on the wounds of a scorched earth advance. Others argue that this moment reveals a rare window into the general's private morality, proving that he viewed the war as a defense of Western civilization rather than a simple exercise in power. What is certain is that the church was restored to its community, and the letter from Father Martel remains a permanent testament to a single moment of humanity in the middle of a global conflict. If you had been standing in the ruins of that village, would you have demanded that same public penance? Or would you have let the casualties of war remain buried in the rubble? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. For more stories about the quiet moments that revealed who he really was, make sure to subscribe.